There is a sound men make when they realize they were never supposed to hear something. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it's internal. A shift in the spine, a tightening in the jaw, a quiet understanding that the world you were handed was edited. Tonight, I am removing the edits. In the summer of 1857, on a sugar plantation 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, a woman everyone believed invisible began committing a crime more dangerous than violence. She began remembering on paper. Her name was Dora. For 18 years, she walked a 40-foot path of jasmine between a detached kitchen house and the rear steps of a white-columned plantation home called Belhaven. 40 feet. That was the distance between fire and silverware, between heat and lemon, between the machinery of power and the illusion of civility. And directly above the final step of that path was a study window that never fully closed in the Louisiana heat. Men talked in that room. They talked about yields, about sugar prices, about land, about weather. And when the bourbon deepened and the shutters half opened, they talked about other things: debts, arrangements, names spoken once and never repeated. Dora carried trays, she stirred stews, she salted meat, she lowered her eyes, and she listened. Here is what you must understand, especially you, the man watching this who believes power only moves through titles and uniforms. The most dangerous intelligence in any hierarchy is the intelligence that is dismissed. Dora was dismissed. She was furniture. She was background. She was the rhythm of a household that believed itself righteous because it never examined its own foundation. But invisibility is a form of camouflage, and camouflage, when patient, becomes leverage. By 1857, Dora knew the Hatfield family more intimately than they knew themselves. She knew the father's concealed debt to men who did not negotiate. She knew the eldest son's gambling letters burned in private fireplaces. She knew the mother's secret correspondence routed through Baton Rouge to avoid local eyes. She knew the younger son was attending meetings that could have ignited the entire parish. She knew which lies were told at dinner and which truths were swallowed with dessert. For 18 years she absorbed it all, and then, one night, something changed. Not outside, inside. A line was crossed, and when a person who has mastered silence decides to break it, they do not shout. They document. What Dora wrote was not gossip, it was architecture. The architecture of corruption. And once architecture is drawn, structures can fall. Stay with me, because this is not just about a plantation in 1857. This is about the system that trained you to ignore who is listening, and why that system always underestimates the wrong person. The first rule of power is simple. Control the story, and you control the memory. Control the memory, and you control the future. Belhaven Plantation did not run on cruelty alone. It ran on narrative. To the outside world, the Hatfield family were stewards of order. They donated to the parish church. They financed road repairs. They hosted dinners where laughter floated across candlelight like proof of stability. The father, Thomas Hatfield, was described in town ledgers as measured and firm, words that sound respectable until you understand what they conceal. Measured meant deliberate. Firm meant unmovable. Unmovable meant no one left without permission. Inside the plantation, children were taught 2 languages, one spoken aloud and one understood without words. The spoken language was about duty, obedience, divine hierarchy. The unspoken one was about fear.
You could see it in the way shoulders stiffened when boots struck hardwood, in the way conversations died when doors opened, in the way servants walked, not slowly, not quickly, but precisely. Precision is the language of survival. Dora understood precision better than anyone. Her small sleeping quarters behind the smokehouse contained almost nothing: a narrow cot, a chipped basin, a wooden crate that served as both table and storage. Inside that crate, beneath folded scraps of worn linen, wrapped in cloth to silence the rustle, were pages. Not many at first, just fragments, dates, names, amounts, phrases overheard through that half-open study window. Shipment delayed, credit extended until harvest, burn it after reading. At first, she wrote because memory felt too heavy to carry alone. But as months passed, something sharpened. She began organizing her notes, grouping them, connecting them. She saw patterns forming where the family saw chaos. Debts rising faster than production, loans taken in secret, meetings with men who arrived after dark and left before sunrise. Belhaven was not stable. It was rotting from inside. And rot in powerful families is rarely financial alone. The eldest son, William, had begun disappearing at night, not to gamble. That was the harmless vice. He attended private gatherings in town where talk of states' rights and necessary measures flowed stronger than whiskey. Talk of militias, talk of preemptive strikes, talk of silencing dissent before it could breathe. Dora heard enough to understand something larger was approaching. War. Not just between states, but within households. What the Hatfields did not realize was that the quiet woman who carried their tea was mapping their vulnerability. And vulnerability, once mapped, becomes a weapon. But Dora was not reckless. She did not seek revenge in the dramatic sense. She understood something far more dangerous: timing. Information revealed too early is dismissed. Information revealed at the right moment reshapes destinies. And the moment was coming. Because powerful men always believe collapse is something that happens to other families, until it doesn't. Stay with me, because the line Dora crossed was not writing the truth. It was deciding who would eventually read it.
The night everything shifted did not begin with shouting. It began with rain. Louisiana rain does not fall politely. It arrives like a verdict, thick, blinding, relentless, the kind that traps carriages in mud and forces men to stay indoors longer than planned. That night, thunder rolled over Belhaven as if the sky itself were warning someone to leave. No one did. Inside the study, 4 men gathered around Thomas Hayfield's desk. The shutters were open an inch to let the humid air breathe. Candlelight flickered against maps spread across polished wood, rail lines, river routes, supply chains. Dora moved between kitchen and house with a tray balanced on steady hands. Steady because she had practiced being steady her entire life. When she entered, she did not look at the maps. She did not look at the men. She set the glasses down with precision and turned to leave. But she listened. "By winter," one man said, "it will be unavoidable." "Then we act before winter," Thomas replied. The words were simple. The tone was not. They were not discussing crops. They were discussing force. William's voice entered next, eager, breath quick with youth. "The parish will follow if you lead. They always do." There it was. Leadership not of land, but of escalation. Dora stepped back into the corridor, heart beating not from fear, but from clarity. The pieces she had been collecting were aligning. Debt, militia meetings, late-night visitors, now timelines. Belhaven was preparing for more than financial survival. They were preparing to choose sides in a conflict that would fracture the nation.
and they intended to secure their influence before the first official shot. But here is what powerful families never anticipate. Their internal fractures widen under pressure. Later that same night, after the men dispersed, Dora passed the rear hallway and heard something she was never meant to hear. Crying, soft, stifled. The sound came from the youngest Hayfield child, Samuel, barely 12 years old. The boy was not built for war talk or political ambition. He trembled in the dark as his older brother whispered sharp instructions. "You will say nothing. You will stand where Father tells you. You will not question." "But what if," Samuel began, "there is no what if." Fear had entered the bloodline, and fear inside a powerful house is more destabilizing than any external enemy. Dora returned to her quarters that night and did something she had not done before. She wrote not just facts, she wrote intentions. She described the rain, the urgency in Thomas's voice, the tremor in Samuel's, the ambition in William's. She began documenting psychology, because wars are not started by geography. They are started by men convincing themselves they are inevitable. And Dora understood something chilling. Belhaven was not reacting to history. It was trying to steer it. But steering history requires stability, and Belhaven was far less stable than it believed. The storm outside passed by morning. The storm inside the house had just begun. Stay with me, because the truth Dora uncovered next would make her writings no longer private observation, but leverage capable of destroying a dynasty.
Every empire has a weak beam. Not the obvious one, not the cracked column everyone can see. The hidden beam, the one holding weight it was never designed to carry. For Belhaven, that beam was not Thomas Hatfield. It was his wife. Margaret Hatfield had perfected the art of appearing serene. She hosted teas while rumors of war brewed in neighboring parishes. She quoted scripture while debt letters accumulated in locked drawers. She smiled at dinner while her eldest son drifted toward radical circles. But serenity is exhausting when built on denial. Dora noticed the changes first. Margaret's hands trembled when sealing letters. Her appetite vanished. She began walking alone near the magnolia trees at dusk, something she had never done before. Solitude is rarely chosen by women in controlled households. It is stolen. One afternoon, as Dora folded linens in the upstairs corridor, she heard the study door close sharply. Voices. Thomas's tone was clipped, irritated. Margaret's was low, urgent. "You promised it would not reach this house," she said. "It won't," Thomas replied. "It already has." Silence. Then the words that shifted everything. "If those papers surface, we are ruined." Papers. Not letters, not rumors. Papers. Dora felt her pulse slow instead of race. When fear becomes specific, it becomes useful. Later that evening, Margaret summoned Dora alone, not for tea, not for errands, for trust. A dangerous mistake. "Bring the blue chest from the attic," Margaret said quietly, "and speak of it to no one." The attic was thick with heat and dust. The blue chest sat beneath a torn quilt, iron lock secured, but poorly hidden. Dora carried it down carefully, feeling the weight, heavier than fabric, lighter than silver. Inside Margaret's sitting room, the chest was opened, and Dora saw them. Legal documents, land deeds, unsigned contracts, correspondence bearing seals from men outside Louisiana, men with influence beyond the parish, men whose names were not spoken at dinner. Margaret's voice barely held together. "If the state fractures, if the banks collapse, this house does not survive scrutiny."
Belhaven's foundation was not just moral rot, it was fraudulent. Land acquisitions made through coercion, loans secured through false projections, partnerships promised but never honored. If war destabilized the South, federal oversight could expose everything. And Dora understood in that instant the Hatfields feared not abolition alone, but audit. Powerful men will defend ideology publicly. They defend money privately. Margaret closed the chest with shaking hands. "These never leave this house," she whispered. But the truth had already left, because Dora now knew something explosive. Belhaven was not choosing war out of loyalty. It was choosing war to bury evidence. And desperation makes powerful families reckless. That night, Dora returned to her quarters and wrote faster than ever before. Not just what she heard, what she understood. Belhaven was cornered, and cornered dynasties do not negotiate, they eliminate threats. The question was no longer whether the Hatfields would fall. The question was how violently they would try to prevent it. Stay with me, because once desperation enters power, someone always gets sacrificed.
Desperation does not shout. It rearranges the furniture. Within weeks of that rain-soaked meeting, Belhaven changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Locks appeared on doors that had never required them. Conversations moved from the study to the carriage house. Letters were no longer burned in fireplaces. They were burned outside in barrels under supervision. Thomas Hatfield had sensed pressure tightening, but he did not know from where. Men like Thomas never imagine the threat is already inside their walls. Dora felt it in the rhythm of the house. The staff were questioned more often. Routes between buildings were altered. William began carrying a revolver even at breakfast. Samuel grew quieter, his childhood evaporating beneath expectations he could not carry. And Margaret? Margaret began drinking before noon. The blue chest disappeared from her sitting room. Dora noticed immediately. She did not ask, she observed. Because observation is power only if it remains undetected. One evening, as dusk folded itself over the sugar fields, Dora witnessed something that clarified the Hatfields' next move. Two riders approached without lanterns. Thomas met them behind the barn, not at the front steps, not in the study, behind the barn. Hidden negotiations are rarely innocent. Dora pretended to gather laundry near the line, her posture casual, her ears precise. She heard fragments carried by wind. Move assets before September. If federal inspectors come, names must disappear. Names, not debts, not shipments, names. That was when she understood the scale. Belhaven was preparing to erase people. Records altered, contract destroyed, testimonies silenced. If war provided chaos, chaos would provide cover. And Dora realized something chilling. Her own existence was not documented beyond inventory logs. If Belhaven needed to remove loose ends, she would not even leave a bureaucratic shadow. That night, she opened her crate and read her pages by candlelight. Dates, conversations, financial trails, intentions. She had been collecting insurance, but insurance only protects if someone else knows it exists. Up until now, her writings had been solitary, hidden, defensive. That was no longer enough, because once powerful families begin discussing erased names, survival requires transition from silent witness to strategic threat. Dora did not sleep. Instead, she made a decision that would change the trajectory of everyone inside that plantation. She tore one page from her bundle, only one,
carefully chosen, containing just enough truth to alarm, not enough to expose her entirely. In the morning, that page would no longer belong to her. It would belong to someone who had reason to fear the Hatfields, because desperation had entered Belhaven, and desperation creates cracks. All Dora needed to do was widen them. Stay with me, because the first crack would not appear in Thomas, it would appear in his son. William Hatfield believed he was untouchable. That is the curse of firstborn sons in powerful houses. They inherit authority before earning wisdom. He walked with the posture of a man already remembered by history. His boots struck the porch with certainty. His voice carried command even when it trembled beneath the surface. But certainty built on unstable ground fractures easily. Dora chose him carefully. Not Thomas, too guarded, not Margaret, too fragile, not Samuel, too frightened. William, because ambition is predictable, and predictable men can be steered. The page she selected was not dramatic. It did not accuse, it did not threaten, it simply recorded a conversation between Thomas and one of the late-night riders, detailing a plan to shift financial liabilities onto William's name should investigations begin. A protective maneuver disguised as trust, a sacrifice disguised as legacy. If authorities traced fraudulent land claims or unpaid debts, the legal burden would rest on the eldest son. Thomas would step aside, grieved publicly but privately insulated. William did not know, and ignorance is combustible. Dora folded the page into quarters and sealed it within a plain envelope. No name, no marking. That afternoon, when William rode into town for one of his meetings, the envelope waited inside his saddlebag. Not placed hastily, placed deliberately. Precision again. By evening, the storm inside Belhaven erupted. Dora did not need to see the contents opened to feel the shift. The house vibrated with it. William returned before sunset. Unheard of. His steps were no longer confident. They were sharp, fast. The study door slammed. Voices rose. "What is this?" William demanded. Thomas's reply was controlled, too controlled. "Where did you get that?" "That is not the question." Silence stretched like a pulled wire. Margaret's voice broke through, panicked. "Lower your tone." William did not. "So I am the shield, the name you burn to protect your own?" Dora stood in the hallway beyond sight, every word embedding itself in memory. Thomas attempted reason. "It is precaution, nothing more." "No," William answered. "It is insurance, and I am the premium." There it was, the crack. Ambition had collided with betrayal. And betrayal inside a family like the Hatfields does not resolve quietly. William stormed from the study that night and did something reckless. He rode back into town, not to meet allies, to meet rivals, men who would gladly exploit internal weakness for leverage. Dora knew the risk of what she had done. She had introduced distrust into a house already under pressure. Distrust multiplies. By dawn, Belhaven was no longer unified. Thomas suspected a leak but could not identify it. Margaret suspected William. William suspected his father, and none of them suspected the quiet woman who served their breakfast. But fractures widen faster than anticipated. Because once a son believes he is expendable, he stops protecting the house. Stay with me, because William's next move would not just destabilize Belhaven, it would invite outsiders into its secrets. When a house built on secrecy begins to fracture, it does not collapse from the outside, it implodes. William did not sleep that night. Pride rarely allows it. Instead, he rode beneath a moon that felt too bright, as if even the sky were watching him reconsider his inheritance. Men like William are raised on a myth, the myth of legacy, the myth that blood guarantees loyalty, the myth that power flows downward from father to son like a sacred inheritance. But power does not flow, it circulates, and when it senses weakness, it moves. By the time dawn brushed the hills of Culpeper, William had made a decision that would alter the trajectory of the Hatfield dynasty. He met with a man his father despised, a rival landowner who had long suspected that Belhaven's rapid acquisitions were fueled by more than honest trade, a man patient enough to wait for cracks in stone. William did not confess everything. He did not need to. He offered just enough, enough to suggest irregularities, enough to imply vulnerability, enough to signal, "I am not my father." That was all the rival required. You see, institutions do not need proof to begin circling prey. They need scent. And William carried it back with him like invisible ink. Meanwhile, inside Belhaven, Thomas felt the shift without knowing its source. Men like him survive by sensing weather before storms break. He summoned Samuel privately. "You've noticed it," Thomas said quietly. Samuel avoided his eyes. "William is unsettled." Thomas leaned back, calculating. Find out why. But Samuel already knew something was wrong. He had seen the envelope, or rather, he had seen Dora handling it hours before William's outburst. He had not questioned it then. Servants moved papers all the time. Now he replayed the image in his mind. Memory is a dangerous ally. Samuel began watching Dora, and Dora knew it. That is the burden of precision. When you move carefully, those who are quiet begin to notice. But she did not retreat, because this was no longer about planting suspicion. It was about escalation. Within a week, the first official inquiry arrived. Not an accusation, merely a request for documentation regarding disputed acreage claims filed under the Hatfield name. Routine, they called it. Thomas recognized it as reconnaissance. He responded with confidence, dispatching records and letters, believing the foundation strong enough to withstand scrutiny. But he did not know which documents William had quietly described in that moonlit meeting. He did not know which vulnerabilities had already been exposed. This is how control systems unravel, not with dramatic arrests, not with public scandal, with paper, with questions, with doubt. Margaret felt it most deeply. She watched her husband age in days. She watched William's loyalty curdle into independence. She watched Samuel's silence grow heavier, and she prayed. But prayer does not reverse momentum, because once truth, even partial truth, leaves the gates of a house like Belhaven, it never returns unchanged. Listen carefully. This is where the story stops being about one family and starts becoming about what happens when control slips from those who believe they are ordained to wield it. We are only descending further, and the fall is accelerating. The moment control begins to slip, it feels almost imperceptible. A glance too long, a door left ajar, a ledger misplaced. These are not mistakes. They are cracks forming in the edifice of power. And those who have spent their lives building walls around themselves do not notice until it is too late. Dora understood this instinctively. She had spent nearly 2 decades cataloging human behavior, memorizing the cadence of fear, the cadence of deception, the cadence of indifference. Every step she took in the kitchen, every plate she carried, every whispered instruction was part of a larger observation. She had seen men bend, women fold, and children adapt, and she had learned the weight of silence. In late July, the first tremors appeared in the accounts. Small discrepancies, subtle entries that didn't align. A shipment recorded but never received. A barrel listed twice. Gerald Habfield dismissed it at first. Mistakes, he said, glancing over the figures with his usual half-interest. But the errors multiplied, and they multiplied in ways that suggested more than carelessness. They suggested design. The estate lawyer, a man who had long served the family with a quiet detachment, noticed too. His eyes, sharp beneath heavy brows, lingered over certain passages in the ledger. He began asking questions, questions that could not be ignored. Dora watched all of this from her vantage point, quietly, calculating. The rhythm of panic had begun, and she understood that the Habfields were incapable of seeing the mechanisms of collapse until they were fully operational. They mistook their wealth, their titles, their social position as shields. But wealth without vigilance is a cage for those who believe themselves free. It was in this atmosphere that William's choices accelerated the cascade. He moved with intention now, exploiting the cracks he had found. Letters went missing. Meetings were delayed. Trust became a currency too expensive to afford. And all the while, Dora and Lenny continued their work, translating observation into record, making invisible knowledge permanent. Mark this moment carefully. This is where the story becomes more than an account of a plantation. This is where you understand the machinery of secrecy, the architecture of power, the precise way influence is hoarded and lost. Later, historians would speculate on the Belhaven collapse. They would assign blame to human error, to mismanagement, to fortune. But those who were present, Dora, Lenny, even William, even Thomas, knew the truth. Institutions are most vulnerable not to force, but to knowledge. And knowledge, once wielded, never forgets. Stay with me. What you are about to hear next will show you the calculus of observation, the methodical patience required to unseat authority, and the cost of secrets when they are finally exposed. By the end of July, Dora's perception had sharpened into something nearly surgical. Every movement in the house, every creak of the floorboards, every muffled sigh carried significance. The Haverfields were no longer unaware. They were reactive, tense, fragile. And Dora knew exactly how fragile. Cyrus Holt remained a shadow over the household, moving through it with the subtle authority of a man whose knowledge exceeded that of everyone around him. His presence alone shifted conversations, dictated pauses, and rewrote the invisible hierarchy of attention. He had arrived ostensibly on business, but his eyes carried judgment, and his tone carried consequence. Dora had learned to read both with precision. The family's youngest son, Robert, had grown restless. He was no longer a boy who wandered or experimented. He was now a participant in dangerous games. Dora observed him as she had always observed, not with fear, not with judgment, but with acute awareness. Every glance he cast, every conversation he entered, every hesitation or overreach, she catalogued it. She could feel the currents of tension flowing through the rooms, like invisible rivers running beneath the floorboards. It was then that she began to write in earnest, not yet dictating to Lenny, but in the careful arrangement of thoughts in her mind. She was constructing a a mental ledger of influence, deceit, and suppressed truths. The Hafferfields believed their homes secure. They believed their secrets insulated. But Dora, invisible and patient, was turning that belief into something tangible, something permanent. The method was deliberate. She started with small entries, names, dates, minor debts, minor indiscretions. Each note, each mental record was a test of her memory, a calibration of risk. And as the days passed, she began layering complexity, letters she had glimpsed, conversations she had overheard, the unspoken intentions in gestures and expressions. The weight of it all was immense, but Dora had carried heavier things silently for years. And here is where the true danger lies, in knowing everything about people who believe they are unknowable, in holding in your mind the architecture of power that no one else sees, in realizing that the act of recording, of translating observation into text, is itself a form of rebellion, quiet, patient, unavoidable. This is the moment where silence transforms into a weapon, where invisibility becomes authority, and where a simple kitchen cook begins to wield the kind of power that men with titles and wealth can never anticipate. Brace yourself. What Dora will put onto paper next will expose the mechanics of privilege, manipulation, and secrecy in ways that can unsettle the strongest mind.
By the first week of August, Dora had begun dictating to Lenny in earnest. The kitchen, once a place of routine labor, had become a chamber of clandestine activity. The air was thick with humidity and tension, but neither of them flinched. The task demanded focus, patience, and a kind of courage that comes from having carried weight in silence for years. She began with the architecture of the household, not just the rooms, but the power flows, the hierarchies, the unspoken rules that governed every interaction. Every gesture in the dining room, every pattern of footsteps along the jasmine path, every deliberate pause in conversation was now captured. Lenny wrote quickly, methodically, his hand guided by Dora's memory and her precise instructions. It was not just names and dates, it was the emotional topography of Belhaven, the way fear manifested in a glance, the way pride twisted into arrogance, the way secrecy created invisible chains that bound the family and the household staff alike. Dora understood intuitively that the most powerful truths were never spoken aloud, they were lived and they could be observed, and now they were being recorded. The first entries were relatively safe. Minor debts, small betrayals, casual lies, the sort of details that could have been dismissed if discovered. But with each night, Dora wove in more dangerous knowledge. Conversations about illicit dealings, men who visited under polite pretenses but carried threats beneath their polished manners, decisions made in closed rooms that affected lives far beyond the plantation. She paused at one point and whispered to Lenny, "Remember, we write not what we feel, but what is. Every word is a lifeline or a trap." He nodded, understanding the gravity of the act. At 14, he was already learning that the world contained truths too dangerous to speak freely, yet too important to remain unrecorded. And here is the first real fracture in the veneer of normalcy at Belhaven. The family, unaware of the invisible ledger being created, carried on with their lives, making decisions that would now be mapped, analyzed, and preserved by the eyes of someone they had consistently ignored. Dora's pen, guided by Lenny's hand, began to transform knowledge into power. This is where knowledge becomes a weapon and silence becomes insurgency. Every secret she recorded was a spark, every careful note a potential explosion, and Dora knew that once the pages existed, the balance of control in the house could never return to what it had been.
The most dangerous truth was yet to come, a revelation that would link greed, fear, and ambition in ways no one in that house could imagine. By the second week of August, the ledger of Belhaven had grown into something that weighed on the air like a storm gathering over the Louisiana plains. Nora's recollections were no longer just observations. They were a blueprint of influence, a map of power, a ledger of human weakness laid bare. Every whispered argument, every hushed transaction, every sigh in the hallways became a thread she wove into a tapestry of truth too dangerous to exist in ordinary light. She told Lenny about the arrangement Gerald Hapfield had maintained for years with the men from New Orleans. The arrangement was layered, hidden beneath polite conversations, under the veneer of social etiquette and plantation propriety. Dora had never understood the full legal or financial mechanics, but she understood patterns, patterns of intent, patterns of threat, patterns that, when connected, revealed that the house and its people were entangled in forces far beyond any ordinary reckoning. Dora dictated the details of Philip's deaths, not merely the sums owed, but the manner in which he attempted to hide them, the letters he burned, the furtive glances he cast when his father approached. She described Cecily's correspondence, not in full content, but in cadence and timing, subtle cues that hinted at schemes, alliances, and secrets beyond polite society's comprehension. Every observation became a living record of subtle manipulation, of power exercised silently, and of the consequences hidden in plain sight. The process required them to move with almost surgical precision. Every sheet of paper stolen from the supply room, every drop of ink diverted from the schoolroom was a small risk that could unravel the entire operation. But with every night that passed, Dora and Lenny grew more adept, more confident. The act of recording became a ritual of control, control over the chaos that had governed the plantation for decades. And here, in this shadowed dance of paper and memory, something extraordinary began to emerge. Dora realized that knowledge, when gathered, curated, and transmitted with intention, could shift the balance of power. The invisible became tangible, the unheard became undeniable, and the furniture of the household, the servants, the overseers, the family themselves, were all moving unknowingly on a stage where Dora held the script. It was also here that she made a decision that would seal her own fate, though she did not yet know it. She would not merely record, she would preserve. Every truth, every fragment, every anomaly that the family assumed was invisible, she would capture. Because to leave it unrecorded would be to betray not herself, but the reality of the house itself, a reality the world would never know without her intervention. And now, as the pages multiplied and the summer heat pressed down like judgment, Dora approached the most dangerous section, the account of Robert Hapfield's actions, the meetings that threatened lives, the secrets that could topple men. The time had come for exposure.
Robert Hapfield's story was the axis upon which the danger of Belhaven rotated. Dora's recollections of him were precise, almost cruelly so. Not because she wished harm, but because clarity was survival. Robert's intelligence had always been bright, but it was untamed, reckless in ways that the family could not comprehend. He had begun weaving himself into networks and ideas far beyond the plantation, questioning agreements, observing patterns, and engaging with people who understood consequences in a language he was only beginning to learn. Dora described to Lenny the nights when Robert would slip away from the main house, disappearing into the shadows with letters and documents he was not supposed to possess. She noted the subtle signs of his absences, the creak of the back gate, the smell of tobacco in unusual corners, the slight disorder of his room that signaled clandestine meetings. She cataloged these details not as gossip, but as evidence. Evidence that would reveal how the Hapfield house, with all its social standing and outward calm, was being manipulated by forces it could not see, forces it could not name. She spoke of the dangerous trust Robert had placed in people outside the household, men who understood risk, who played a long game, who were patient in ways that terrified her. And here Dora made a critical distinction. Intelligence without comprehension of consequence is a sword without a hilt. Robert's brilliance was unshielded. It cut, but it could not defend itself. The men who observed him from Baton Rouge, who questioned the transactions of Gerald Happerfield, were predators cloaked in civility. They were aware of everything, calculating what must be done, while Robert moved forward unaware of the magnitude of his exposure. In this section, Dora began documenting not only actions, but the patterns of human psychology that sustained the plantation's hierarchy. She recorded the way fear, ignorance, and misplaced loyalty coalesced to maintain control. How obedience is not just enforced by chains, but by subtle understanding that survival often depends on silence, on selective blindness, on pretending not to see what everyone knows. And in this, she recognized something terrifying. Power is not always exercised visibly. Often it is the absence of observation that binds the world. Then Dora described the convergence, the man who had approached her through the vegetable garden, the conversation she overheard at the study window, the subtle signs that Robert's actions were no longer just his own, they were a catalyst. If exposed, the consequences would ripple across the plantation, touching the lives of every worker, every visitor, every family member. And Dora understood in that moment that her pen, guided by Lenny's hand, was the only force capable of preserving the truth before the impending collapse. And here is where the first moment of transformation occurs. Dora instructed Lenny to pause, look at the pages they had filled, and repeat a phrase aloud. I see what others hide, twice. Not for amusement, not for habit, but to lock their identities into a shared act of awakening. The ritual of speech, of recognition, was as important as the record itself. It bound them to the truth they carried, sealing their minds to the gravity of what they were creating.
That night, as Dora and Lenny worked under the dim glow of the kitchen's hearth, the house around them seemed to hold its breath. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant murmur, every whisper of wind through the shutters became part of the narrative they were constructing. Dora's dictation was deliberate, measured, each word chosen as if it were a weapon or a shield. She recounted the pattern of Robert's secretive absences, the way his eyes would flicker toward corners where no one else was, and the subtle gestures that betrayed him to anyone paying attention. She began to catalog the invisible architecture of power at Belhaven, not the bricks or timber, not the sugarcane fields or the ledger books, but the web of relationships, fears, and dependencies that held the plantation together. Dora described how each person, her, the Hatfields, the overseers, even the visiting men from New Orleans, occupied a node in a larger system, a system that could be unraveled if someone understood its hidden rules. She traced the patterns of secrecy, how debts were hidden, letters misdirected, alliances formed in silence, and how fear was wielded not as overt punishment, but as a constant, almost imperceptible pressure on every action and thought. Then came the stories that no one outside the household had heard. The untimely death of Terence in 1851, which Dora had long suspected was not natural. The mysterious sale of Addie in 1848, the hushed conversations she overheard, the veiled threats whispered behind closed doors. She detailed them for Lenny with the precision of a historian, noting not only the events, but the currents of power and fear that caused them. Every sentence layered with implication, every recollection a revelation of the machinery operating invisibly beneath the surface of polite society. Dora spoke of her own transformation in those years. She had learned to see without being seen, to hear without being heard. The invisible labor of observation had become her strength, but it had also made her complicit in a dangerous game. By recording the truth, she was no longer just a witness, she became a participant, a custodian of knowledge that could topple reputations, shatter lives, and illuminate the darkness that the plantation had spent decades hiding. As Lenny wrote, their shared act became almost ritualistic. Every word they inscribed was a step further into forbidden knowledge. Dora instructed him again to repeat the phrase, "I see what others hide," this time slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of the statement settle into their bones. Twice. This repetition was no simple chant, it was an initiation into the dangerous awareness they were forging. Once spoken aloud, it bound them to the story, to the truth, to the understanding that ignorance is not safety, and that knowledge is both a weapon and a responsibility. The night stretched long, but by its end they had mapped the first contours of the hidden world within Belhaven. What had once been an abstract sense of danger became tangible, structured, and recorded. Dora's voice trembled not with fear, but with the gravity of knowing she had crossed a line. She had begun turning silence into evidence, invisibility into power. The following days were charged with a tension that hovered like smoke in the summer air. Dora moved through the kitchen and along the jasmine-covered walkway with the same deliberate rhythm, yet each step was heavier now, weighted by the knowledge that what she had begun could not be undone. Lenny, for his part, carried a new kind of awareness. The act of writing down the plantation's hidden truths had changed him. His eyes, once curious and cautious, now gleamed with the recognition that the world could be read and manipulated if one knew how to listen. Dora continued to dictate, her stories growing darker, deeper. She revealed the subtleties of Gerald Hatfield's governance, not merely the surface mechanics of sugar yields and accounts, but the hidden levers of influence. She described how Gerald's indifference, his habitual blindness to the lives of those around him, was not mere negligence, it was a cultivated form of control. People who are unseen can be observed without fear. People whose presence is systematically erased become instruments of silence. And Dora had learned to exploit that invisibility, transforming it into a repository of secrets more powerful than any weapon. She recounted the New Orleans men, the persistent shadow of Cyrus Halt, and the network of debts, favors, and unspoken threats that extended beyond the plantation, beyond even Gerald's awareness. Every name, every transaction, every gesture she recorded formed a lattice of power and corruption that few could comprehend. It was as though she had been constructing a secret map of a hidden empire, its boundaries invisible to those who occupied it. And yet, by recording it, by making it tangible on paper, she was constructing a danger as real as any physical threat. Then came the most subtle, insidious truths, the psychological architecture of the plantation, how fear and loyalty were intertwined, how obedience was not enforced through punishment alone, but through the careful calibration of rewards, recognition, and invisibility. Dora detailed how people like herself, like Lenny, existed in a perpetual state of conditional freedom, always aware that observation itself was a currency, that knowing too much or too little could endanger a life. This was not theory, it was survival, codified over years of silent vigilance. By the 8th night, Dora and Lenny had reached the events of the past year, when the threads of secrecy began to tighten, when the Hatfield household was beginning to fracture in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Dora spoke of the convergence of deaths, of clandestine meetings, of letters misdirected, and of whispers that had passed unnoticed through open windows. Each detail, each fragment was a spark. Together, they formed a blaze that threatened to illuminate the darkest corners of the plantation. And yet, As dangerous as the knowledge was, Dora felt a strange clarity. She understood more than ever that the act of writing was transformative. It was a declaration of existence, a defiance of the forces that had rendered her invisible. She repeated the phrase with Lenny once more, "I see what others hide," twice, sealing the ritual, binding them irrevocably to the truths they now possessed. By the end of that week, the manuscript had grown heavier than either of them realized, not in weight, but in consequence. Every word carried the potential to upend lives, to disrupt the invisible hierarchies of control. Dora understood the danger. She also understood that silence had already exacted its toll, and that speaking, even in written form, was the only path to reclaiming power.
By the 9th night, the air in the kitchen house had thickened with anticipation, almost like the prelude to a storm. Dora moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed every action 1,000 times in her mind. Lenny sat on the worn wooden stool, quill in hand, ready to translate her voice into words that would endure beyond the walls, beyond the ceilings, beyond the gaze of those who thought themselves safe. The first 8 nights had been preparatory. Now she was ready to confront the heart of the darkness. Dora began with Robert, the youngest Havfield son, the one whose mind had outpaced his caution. She recounted his secret meetings, the oblique conversations in private rooms, the coded letters, and the dangerous documents he had handled. Dora spoke not just of the events, but of the motives behind them, the invisible forces shaping a world he did not fully comprehend. Lenny wrote swiftly, almost breathlessly, as though fear itself could be captured in ink. Every word was a revelation, every sentence a trapdoor into a hidden reality. Then Dora moved to her master, Gerald Havfield. She described him not merely as a man, but as an institution of ordinary evil, the kind that thrives in complacency. Gerald was not cruel in the theatrical sense. He was methodical, deliberate in his blindness. He believed he controlled the plantation through oversight, yet it was his very inability to see, his habitual erasure of human life from consideration, that allowed secrets to accumulate, like sediment beneath a river. Dora had witnessed this accumulation for nearly 2 decades, and now she was giving it form. She described the tension that had entered the household with the arrival of Cyrus Halt, the man from Memphis who had become both instrument and threat. Dora recalled every syllable, every pause, every subtle inflection that revealed the stakes at play. She detailed the hidden network of debts, favors, and whispered threats that connected the plantation to distant powers. By the end of her dictation, the kitchen house seemed to pulse with the weight of knowledge, as if the air itself had absorbed the danger. And then came the letters, Cecily Havfield's clandestine correspondence with her sister in Richmond. Dora described not just the logistics of the letters, but their content as she had inferred it. Plans, conspiracies, social maneuvering, attempts to manipulate distant allies in ways that would destabilize the fragile balance of power on the plantation. These letters, seemingly innocuous, were in fact threads woven into a tapestry of control and deceit that spanned miles, lives, and secrets too dangerous for anyone outside the Havfield household to understand. At this point, Dora paused and looked at Lenny. She repeated the phrase again, slowly, deliberately, for the second time. "I see what others hide." Twice. Not as instruction, but as an invocation. It was a ritual, a seal, a recognition that the knowledge they now possessed could never be unlearned, and that it would change them irrevocably. Lenny nodded, a solemn acknowledgement of the weight they bore together. By the time the 9th night ended, Dora had finished the most perilous sections of her dictation. The manuscript, hidden beneath the floorboards, contained more than just secrets. It contained power.
And power, once revealed, does not disappear quietly. It ripples, touching everything and everyone, and it is remembered long after the world has tried to forget.
The 10th night arrived with an oppressive heat that pressed against the walls, the ceiling, and even the very air inside the kitchen house. Dora lit the small lantern, its glow trembling in the dim room, and settled into her chair. Lenny's quill scratched urgently across the paper, each word a hammer striking the surface of history itself. Tonight, they would move from observation to interpretation. Tonight, Dora would reveal not just what had happened, but why it had been allowed to happen, and the human cost that no ledger, no record, no polite conversation would ever acknowledge. She began with the invisible infrastructure of the plantation, the quiet mechanisms that ensured obedience, compliance, and silence. These were not the rules written in law, but the rules enforced through fear, tradition, and careful erasure of identity. Every glance, every word, every slight misstep had consequences. Dora described how subtle cues, how the Hatfields walked, how they gestured, how their servants moved, were part of a larger, unspoken language of power. She traced how small acts of invisibility, like her own, were both protective and damning. Lenny wrote it all down, understanding more deeply than ever that the architecture of control was not physical but psychological, and it extended far beyond the walls of Belhaven. Then came the stories of the people whose lives had been crushed under this architecture. Dora spoke of Terence, the man in the fields, whose death had carried the silent mark of knowledge too dangerous to survive. She spoke of Addie, sold away without a trace, the shadows of her life and suffering carried in whispers through the years. She spoke of the fear, the obedience, and the quiet intelligence of those like herself, forced to witness everything while being treated as nothing. Lenny's hand trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that they were recording truths the world had been designed to erase. Dora then returned to the Hatfield family, tracing the hidden fractures beneath their polished surfaces. She revealed the financial manipulations, the secret correspondences, the alliances formed in shadows, and the silent panic that had begun to gnaw at Gerald's carefully constructed sense of control. She described the subtle ways power corrupted even the seemingly benign, the way Cecily's letters, Robert's secret meetings, and Philip's debts were all expressions of human ambition constrained by social structures, greed, and fear. Every revelation was a thread pulled from a tapestry that had long concealed a darker pattern. As the night deepened, Dora's voice took on a weight that seemed almost unbearable. She whispered about the cumulative effect of 18 years of listening, observing, and understanding, how it had transformed her from a silent witness into a keeper of dangerous truths. Lenny's hand moved with deliberate care, aware that every mark on the page was a rebellion, every sentence a defiance against the system that had sought to render Dora invisible. By the time the lantern burned low, the manuscript was heavy with insight, consequence, and moral gravity. Dora looked at Lenny and said softly, "What we carry is not just knowledge, it is responsibility." Twice she repeated it, ensuring the words sank into the consciousness of the boy who had become her co-conspirator. In that moment, the quiet kitchen house became a sanctuary of forbidden truth, a place where silence had been shattered and a new, dangerous awareness was born.
The next morning, the sunlight in the kitchen was harsher than usual. Dora moved with a quiet deliberation, each step measured, each action a mask of normalcy. Outside, the jasmine clung to the pergola, its fragrant white flowers oblivious to the weight of what had been set into motion inside. Lenny arrived, his eyes still bright with the adrenaline of last night's work.
Together, they began the next phase, organizing the manuscript so that the chaos of 18 years could be made coherent, legible, and, most dangerously, convincing. Dora dictated with a precision that startled even herself. She realized that knowledge, when freed from the confines of memory and observation, demanded structure. The events of each year, each season, each overheard word and hidden document had to be placed carefully so that the reader would understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. Lenny wrote rapidly, the quill scratching furiously as the story of Belhaven Plantation took shape on the coarse sheets of paper. The pages became a weapon in silence, an archive of the invisible, a record of the truths that had been deliberately buried. She described the patterns of the household with unflinching clarity, the way power operated through omission, how fear and complacency reinforced one another, and how the invisible threads of influence ran through every action, every conversation. Dora explained how the Hoffields believed themselves untouchable, but that their control relied on the blind complicity of those around them. She illustrated the paradox. The more they believed they had power, the more fragile it became, and the less they noticed those who observed, recorded, and understood. Lenny wrote every word with a growing sense of reverence and dread, knowing that what they were creating was not merely a document, it was a map of human ambition, deception, and destruction. Then Dora turned to herself. She acknowledged the danger she now carried. For 18 years she had been invisible, shielded by assumptions and ignorance, but the act of writing, of dictating, of externalizing her knowledge had transformed that invisibility into something vulnerable. Every word they wrote was a potential threat, a spark that could ignite consequences beyond their imagination. She explained to Lenny how systems of secrecy operate, that knowledge alone is neutral, but when wielded carefully, it becomes power, and when exposed, it can topple empires, ruin lives, or rewrite history. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Lenny's hand hovered over the quill. He felt it too, the sense that they were no longer merely recording history. They were creating it, defining it, and in some way controlling its consequences. The room was silent except for the scratch of ink on paper, the subtle creak of the floorboards, and the low hum of anticipation that comes with understanding that the truth, once released, can never be contained again. By mid-morning, the first dozen pages were complete. Dora leaned back, exhausted but resolute. She looked at Lenny and said, "Remember, what we do here is not just writing, it is a warning." Twice she repeated it, her tone deliberate, locking the gravity of the act into the boy's mind. There was no turning back now.
Dora's warning hung in the air like a shadow. She knew that knowledge, once committed to paper, carried a gravity far heavier than any physical burden she had ever borne. For 18 years she had carried secrets in her mind, bending herself into the shape the household required, blending into walls, floors, and furniture. Now those secrets were taking on a new form, words, sentences, documents that could outlive her, that could be discovered, interpreted, weaponized. She realized the paradox. The act of recording made her invisible vigilance visible, and visibility carried its own danger. She began with the smallest details, those that no one ever noticed, the arrangement of silverware in the dining room, the exact timing of the morning bell, the cadence of her mistress's voice when speaking privately to the Hamfield sons. These were not trivialities, they were patterns, the hidden architecture of control and compliance. A person who understood these patterns could predict behavior, manipulate outcomes, and expose the fragility hidden behind the Hamfields' outward certainty.
Dora dictated each observation slowly, with deliberate care, ensuring Lenny captured the nuances, the slight tension in Gerald's shoulders when certain men from New Orleans arrived, the way Cecily's hand trembled when writing letters she did not want intercepted, Robert's restless eyes as he read forbidden documents. Dora was methodical, almost surgical in the way she reconstructed events. She understood that fear is not always loud. It hides in hesitation, in the micro-expressions people fail to control, in the whispers between trusted associates. She narrated the slow erosion of power, the invisible cracks in the household's facade, the secrets that each member carried and believed safely hidden. Lenny wrote each detail with precision, his hands trembling at times because he understood that he was documenting a system of control few could ever comprehend, and that knowledge could kill. Then she shifted to the most delicate and dangerous part, the alliances, the betrayals, and the debts that had never been spoken aloud. Dora described the network of unspoken loyalties, the hidden transactions, and the silent enforcers who moved through the shadows. She named no names aloud. She relied on careful notation, shorthand, and the boys' understanding of context to preserve meaning while protecting them. Each line was a map of power and vulnerability, a blueprint that could ruin or liberate, depending on who held it. As the day wore on, Dora paused and looked at Lenny. She spoke with a quiet intensity that made him shiver. The world outside this house does not see what we see here. Most people never notice the mechanisms that control them, but once you see them, you cannot unsee them. Twice, I want you to remember, the shadow speaks through paper. Say it aloud now. Lenny repeated the phrase, feeling the weight of its truth. She repeated it herself, confirming their shared commitment to the dangerous knowledge they now carried. By evening, the two were exhausted but relentless. Every page was a careful strike against silence, a crystallization of everything Dora had witnessed. She knew that once this document existed, there would be no undoing it. The house, the plantation, the people, they were all now part of a story that demanded to be told, that could expose hidden networks of power and corruption beyond the walls of Belhaven.
Night fell over Belhaven, and the oppressive Louisiana heat began to soften, but the tension in the kitchen house remained sharp, almost tangible. Dora and Lenny worked in near silence, the only sounds the scratching of the pen and the occasional pop from the hearth. Each word Dora dictated carried more than mere information. It carried the weight of lives, of hidden intentions, of consequences that could ripple decades into the future. She had learned to recognize the language of danger, not loud threats, but small anomalies, subtle gestures, a pause in conversation that hid everything behind it. Every detail she shared with Lenny was carefully chosen, calculated to preserve truth without alerting those who could destroy them. The secrets she revealed that night went beyond numbers, letters, and meetings. She began documenting the psychology of the Halffields, how Gerald's outward calm was a mask for relentless anxiety, how Cecily's social precision concealed strategic manipulations, how Philip's recklessness masked insecurity, and how Robert's brilliance teetered dangerously close to naive overconfidence. These were not trivial observations. They were the architecture of power itself, the hidden rules that allowed the plantation to operate, the invisible levers that controlled every human action within it. Dora described the unspoken hierarchy among the enslaved workers, the subtle networks of information that moved quietly beneath the surface. She explained how rumors, overheard conversations, and careful observation could shift allegiances and influence outcomes in ways that no overseer, no master could ever anticipate. Lenny wrote everything with growing urgency, understanding that they were documenting not just history, but the mechanisms of control that had long gone unnoticed and unchallenged.
As the night deepened, Dora's voice took on a harsher edge. She recounted the stories that had haunted her for years, the sudden deaths, the disappearances, the inexplicable punishments that were never questioned. She described how fear and obedience were cultivated with surgical precision, and how silence was enforced both by law and by human cruelty. Every incident, every detail became a thread in a tapestry of power and corruption that most people would never see. But she had seen it all, and now it would live on paper. At one point, she paused and looked at Lenny with intensity that pierced the dim light. "Understand this," she said, her voice low and commanding. "These are not just stories, they are warnings. If you carry them forward, you carry a responsibility. You must see the forces that control men before they see you." Lenny nodded, feeling the gravity of the instructions settle in his chest. Then Dora asked him to repeat the symbolic phrase once more. "The shadow speaks through paper." Twice they spoke it aloud, sealing their pact with the dangerous knowledge they now held in their hands. By the time the first glimmers of dawn brushed the horizon, nearly half of the story was transcribed. Each page held a truth too heavy to bear silently, and yet the act of writing was also a liberation. Dora understood that what they were creating was not just a record, it was a weapon, a mirror, and a warning, capable of shifting the balance of understanding for anyone who dared to read it.
The next night, Dora returned to the pages with a resolve that had hardened into something almost frightening. By now, Lenny no longer needed instructions. He moved with the precision of a man who understood the terrain of secrets, the subtle dangers hidden in every sentence. Dora dictated quietly, yet her words carried a power that could cut through walls and ceilings, through the illusion of safety that the Halffields had maintained for decades. She began to record the intersections, the moments where human ambition collided with greed, where naivety met cold calculation, where loyalty and betrayal were inseparable from survival. She spoke of Philip's debts, not as numbers on paper, but as fractures in the foundation of privilege. She described how a young man's recklessness could ripple outward, touching merchants in New Orleans, attorneys in Baton Rouge, and creditors whose patience was measured in the sort of time that crushed those unprepared. Dora chronicled not just events, but their consequences, the subtle shifts in behavior, the whispers among servants, the changing postures of men who believed themselves untouchable. She described how even the Halffields' careful planning relied on the ignorance of others, and how the illusion of control was the most dangerous form of power. Then she turned to Cecily, whose outward composure was a mask for secret strategies that could rival any general's battlefield planning. Dora described the letters to Richmond, the coded messages, the clandestine arrangements that allowed a woman, legally and socially powerless, to influence outcomes that affected entire households. Each revelation peeled back another layer, exposing the machinery of influence hidden in polite smiles and carefully maintained social etiquette. Lenny's hand trembled occasionally, not from fear of discovery, but from the recognition that he was capturing knowledge designed to unsettle even the most confident. Dora paused to breathe, allowing the weight of the secrets to settle between them. Then she spoke of Robert, the most dangerous unknown in the household. His intelligence, she explained, had outpaced the systems that should have contained it. He moved in shadows, reading, learning, connecting ideas that his elders could not comprehend. But brilliance, Dora noted, without discipline is a volatile force, and it was Robert's volatility that had prompted the mysterious visitor in the garden, the warning that some things could not be trusted to youth alone. She looked at Lenny with an intensity sharpened by years of survival. "Do you see it?" she asked. "Every action, every word, every secret here is a lever,
And the right lever, pulled at the right moment, can topple even giants. That is what I have learned. That is what you must understand." Lenny nodded again, silently acknowledging the dangerous truth they were now custodians of. By the end of the night, the second portion of the account was complete. It mapped the invisible structures of fear and power within the plantation, an anatomy of control hidden behind polite surfaces and quiet halls. Dora and Lenny were no longer simply documenting history. They were exposing a system, revealing the psychological machinery that made men complicit, and ensuring that even centuries later it would never go unnoticed.
The nights grew hotter as August pressed on, and the kitchen house seemed to hold the weight of more than its own heat. Dora's voice was measured, calm, but every word she spoke carried the gravity of a world unseen, a world that had always existed just beyond the sight of those in power. She moved carefully through the events of the summer, threading together every observation from the Hayfield household, the debts, the clandestine letters, the dangerous associations, the subtle shifts in alliances. Lenny's hand never faltered, though sweat beaded his forehead. He was learning, as Dora had long learned, that knowledge itself is a weapon, and that wielding it carries responsibilities and consequences far heavier than mere fear. She spoke now of the servants, of those whose faces were considered invisible, whose lives were measured in tasks rather than moments. Dora detailed the coded behaviors, the silent communications, the glances exchanged in hallways and kitchens that meant more than words could ever convey. She explained how these hidden signals formed a parallel intelligence, a network of observation and interpretation that had been in operation for decades without the notice of the household's masters. Every gesture, every subtle correction, every careful smile, these were the threads that held a hidden truth together, a truth Dora now ensured would be preserved on paper. Then came the moments that no one should have heard, but Dora had heard, and now needed to commit to record. The whispered arguments between Gerald and Cyrus Halt, the precise calculations of debts and assets, the veiled threats hidden in polite tones, all of it formed a map of power that extended beyond the plantation itself into the social, political, and economic arteries of Louisiana. Dora described how every choice, every oversight, every deliberate omission created a network of leverage, where ignorance was cultivated as a tool of control. She showed how the Hayfield's entire world rested on illusions, an intricate lattice of belief and denial that could collapse with the revelation of a single hidden truth. Her voice took on a sharper edge as she recounted Robert's activities. She spoke of the backroom gatherings, the unrecorded meetings, the small rebellions of intellect and courage that had begun quietly, almost imperceptibly, under the gaze of those who thought themselves untouchable. "He is dangerous," Dora said, "not because he is violent, but because he thinks, and thinking in a house built on obedience is the greatest threat." She paused, letting the words linger, watching Lenny process the weight of them. And then, as the night deepened and the air grew thick with the sense of cooking fires and jasmine, Dora reached a pivotal decision. It was time to bind these fragments together, to give them structure, to create a document that could survive the scrutiny of generations, that could carry the full weight of what had been seen and heard. For the first time, she felt the enormity of what she was undertaking, not just an act of memory, but an act of defiance. The paper under Lenny's hand was no longer mere sheets. It had become a repository of truth, a ledger of power, a testament to the knowledge of those who were always invisible. By the end of this night, the framework of her account was complete. She had begun to see the story in its full shape, a story that could shake the very foundations of Belhaven Plantation if ever fully read. And in that realization, a dangerous clarity settled over her.
Some truths are meant to be hidden, yet others, once known, demand to be preserved.
Dora's mind, honed by 18 years of silent observation, began to see the connections that no one else in the house could. She traced the lineage of every secret, every debt, every clandestine meeting, and every whispered conversation. Each thread led to another, creating a web far larger than the walls of Belhaven. The Halffields were not merely a family, they were a nexus in a network of influence and corruption that reached into Baton Rouge, New Orleans, even beyond. And in this web, the servants, Dora included, were invisible witnesses, cataloging truths no law acknowledged, no ledger recorded, and no authority would ever credit. She dictated slowly, deliberately, the events that had seemed inconsequential at the time, but now revealed themselves as vital nodes in this hidden architecture. Lenny wrote, occasionally stopping to ask for clarification, his eyes wide with the realization that he was helping create a document that could destroy lives if discovered. Dora nodded, understanding that he could not yet grasp the full danger, but knowing that this was how knowledge spreads, first through comprehension, then through careful, deliberate action. Each word inscribed on the coarse paper was a spark in the dark, a signal that the invisible had become visible. The more Dora spoke, the more she felt the pulse of the plantation, as if it were a living, breathing organism. She described how the kitchen house, the rear garden, the jasmine-covered path, all these mundane spaces served as conduits of observation. She recalled moments when gestures, glances, and unspoken words had conveyed information far beyond what anyone imagined. These small signals were not merely survival tools, they were instruments of control and resistance. Every action in the household created a feedback loop, some for power, some for secrecy, and some for protection. Dora's account revealed all of it, unvarnished and raw. She also detailed the moments of fear, real fear that had accompanied her observations. The tension in the study when Cyrus Halt arrived, the nervous glances Robert exchanged during meetings, the letters Cecily carefully encrypted and conveyed through invisible channels. Dora had known the consequences of discovery, but she had also understood that silence could be as dangerous as speaking. In the hierarchy of power, knowing and not acting created vulnerability. Her decision to dictate, to preserve these truths, was an act of both defiance and self-preservation. By the time the night reached its deepest hour, the pages had begun to form a chronicle of the unseen world, the machinery of secrets, manipulation, and control. Dora realized something profound. The act of writing was no longer just documentation, it was transformation. By giving these truths a voice, she was changing the balance of power, not just for the Halffields, but for anyone who might ever read them. And she knew, instinctively, that some of these truths were lethal, not in the abstract, but in the tangible, immediate way that knowledge can threaten those who believe themselves untouchable. The weight of the night pressed down, but Dora felt a rare clarity. For the first time in her life, her silence had a purpose, and that purpose was dangerous, beautiful, and irreversible.